Wait, take their screens away too.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important live webinar with Charlotte Korchak from Stand With Us. I'm Donna Weintraub.
Wait, Donna, we're not starting yet.
We're not starting yet, Donna.
He's chatting me. It was blinking.
No.
Yeah, no, that just
I'll
means
introduce
that
you,
now
don't
people
worry.
can join, so we all want to be quiet, and people are already joining. So we're all gonna. Actually, no one is joined yet, but like we all need to be quiet as people join, and then you'll start, Donna.
No, Josh is gonna put my face on here, and I'll say, Donna, you're up, okay?
Sorry. That was funny.
Hi all, we're gonna start in just 2 minutes from now. Hi, all. I would like to welcome you to our Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey's webinar. We have a very special speaker today, somebody I think very highly of, who you'll hear being introduced from Donna Weintraub, one of our members here from Federation. My name is Ariella Novak. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Relations Committee, and I work for the Federation. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Donna to introduce Charlotte. Go ahead.
Thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Donna Weintraub, a member of the Board of Trustees of Jewish Federation, as Ariella said, the Women's Philanthropy Campaign Co-Vice President, and the chair of Federation's ICANN Teen Leadership Program. Before we get started, I wanted to fill you in a little bit on what Federation has been up to. We all know it's been a very challenging time, and much of Federation's focus and allocations have been directed toward providing relief for victims impacted by COVID-19. Your support has never been more critical. Federation has already allocated more than $300,000 to provide much needed personal protection equipment, economic relief, food for seniors, and the restocking of food pantries for agencies who are on the front line. Every week, our community's needs increase, and so does the hope that people like yourselves will step up and say, Hineni, here I am. So if you haven't already made a donation to the Federation, the time is now, because our community needs you now more than ever before. So before we start the program, allow me please to tell you a little bit about why we are so excited to have Charlotte Korczak with us today. Charlotte is the senior educator and director of the International Student Programs at Stand With Us Israel, where she educates and trains students from all around the world in the Israeli history and activism. In her current role, Charlotte has worked with over 10,000 students from nearly every continent, training them to be effective advocates for the state of Israel. Charlotte has quickly become one of the foremost public speakers in her field, and after seeing her in action with our own Federation ICANN teams, it is no surprise. I know that you're in for a great session today. Charlotte, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Donna and Ariella, for those warm introductions. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm here live from Jerusalem. That's where I'm located. I always like to say that just in case I ever say here and you know that I'm talking about Israel. But hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So just a little bit about my background so you know where I'm coming from and kind of how I got to my role at Stand With Us. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. So as you can tell from my lack of accent, I was not a native born Israeli. I grew up living in Los Angeles until I was 9. You could say that I lived in a Zionist household, but as a 9-year-old, what does that actually mean? And I mean, Israel was obviously a topic, but I didn't know much as a 9-year-old. At 9 years old, though, my parents made a very bold decision to actually move to Israel, make Aliyah, and move me and my 4 older siblings to Israel. That will actually be my first time ever coming to Israel as a 9-year-old making Aliyah with my family. First stop was a Jewish community in Judea and Samaria, or a settlement in the West Bank. Again, as a 9-year-old, little did I know how controversial that was. We lived there for a year, mainly just because it was cheap and my family had friends living in this community, so we thought it would be a soft landing, and it really was. But after a year of living in a tiny town, us Los Angelinos realized big cities were really where we were meant to be. And so we made our way to the biggest city in Israel, which is obviously Jerusalem. And we lived here for 4 years here in Jerusalem. During that time, I obviously was growing up. And in the year 2000, I had turned 13. And a month later, the second Intifada started. And it's actually, it's funny because it actually, my whole story plays a huge role in what we're going to speak about today, which is the peace process and where we're at today, but also how we got to where we are today. And every step of the way, kind of the second Intifada will play a huge role in that, the same way that it played a huge role in my life. The second Intifada was, of course, that big wave of terrorism that struck Israel starting in the year 2000. And it will really be my real first introduction into the conflict. As much as you might say, well, you lived there, how do you, but I was a kid and I didn't really notice what was going on around me. It became impossible to ignore what was going on around me when buses started to blow up and restaurants started to blow up. And then, of course, the moment that we all dread, which was the moment that I turned on the news and discovered that a suicide bomber had blown himself up in a place where a bunch of my friends were, and finding out the next morning that 2 of my friends had been killed. And then a week and a half later, another one of my friends dying of her wounds. So really my introduction to the conflict was I was thrust into it in a really emotional way as a kid, as an adolescent. And it was traumatic for me, no doubt about it. The second Intifada left an indelible mark on me, on how I look towards the future, on how I think about peace, as it did for many Israelis. Now, my family during the Intifada realized we couldn't survive here anymore. The economy had crashed, our business went bankrupt. So we moved back to the US. We moved actually from Jerusalem to Las Vegas. It was very weird, like the holy city to the city of sin. And I found myself in a whole new reality. You know, I moved from a place that is, you know, historic and significant and religious to all these people. And then I moved to Vegas, which is none of those things. And if you think it's that important, you have a problem. And there's a number that I can give you that you can call. But we moved to Vegas and I found myself, like I said, in a different world. I was going to an inner city school, which is a whole new type of terror that I now had to deal with. You know, people being beat up in the hallways. That was violence that I never really experienced in Israel, that type of violence. It didn't last long. We lasted a year in Vegas, ended up moving out to Maryland, which is where I ended up finishing up high school. And it was really in Maryland where when we moved, it was all of a sudden this reality of like, oh, I'm living in the United States and I'm gonna have to go to a university and I have to get into a good university. And so I started to get active and do other things when I was in high school. You might think, oh, this is where she's gonna get active for Israel. No. It was 2003, 2004. And unfortunately, you know, for many of us, first of all, not unfortunately necessarily, but first of all, we were unaware of an anti-Israel movement. Me as a 16, 17-year-old kid, there was no social media to expose me to an anti-Israel movement. I lived in a Jewish bubble, so I didn't experience anti-Israel or anti-Semitism, anti-Israel rhetoric or anti-Semitism in that environment. So to be honest with you, I was going through high school and there was no ICANN and there were no programs. There was no Stand With Us high school internship. And more importantly, there was not even an awareness that Israel activism was something that you could take part in. And so I did, again, other random things when I was in high school, didn't really get involved in anything Israel-like. And also there was very little that I could have gotten involved with, to be honest with you, because back at that time, we were really just getting started in the Israel activism world. And there were really almost no programs for high school students at that time. So things were developing. And so when I somehow managed to please the college gods through the different things that I did when I was in high school. I made it to USC, the University of Southern California. And first 6 months, normal college experience, went to football games, you know, did my thing, had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. Come second semester, and I'm walking on campus one day, and I literally felt like I got hit in the face with the apartheid wall. Now, I didn't know what that was. Here I was, an 18-year-old kid out of high school, never experienced anything anti-Israel. Again, social media is at its really infancy at this stage. And so I was, again, completely unaware. And all of a sudden I see this apartheid wall and I'm seeing these accusations made against Israel, you know, that it's an apartheid country, that Zionism is racism. And I had no idea how to respond. And that to me was probably the hardest part of all of it, was I knew that what was being said wasn't true, but I didn't know how to defend myself or defend Israel. And that kicked me off on a journey that has lasted now 13 years. It started with me coming to Israel, learning more about the conflict, eventually finding Stand With Us, an organization that I've now been a part of as an employee for 10 years. I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary a week ago with the organization. And as a student, I was also very active with Stand With Us for about 3 years of my time at USC. And so I jumped and got involved with Stand With Us, an organization that is there to educate people about Israel and to also obviously give tools and resources to students to be able to counter anti-Israel activity in their high schools or on their campuses, and also be able to promote Israel positively and be proactive about Israel, not just be responsive and wait until somebody says something bad to say something good. Say something good all the time, which is very much a philosophy of Stand With Us. So that's a little bit about my background. Like I said, I've been with Stand With Us now 10 years. I graduated from USC with a degree in Middle Eastern history. And ever since I've really been working for Stand With Us, I spent 2.5 years on college campuses in the United States. And I spent the last 7.5 years here in Israel, working with students who come to visit Israel, as well as going on speaking tours around the world to talk about this topic. So let's dive into the topic at hand. Very cute title that we laid out for this one, which was, is peace possible without a handshake in this time of Corona? And I love that topic. But, you know, it's so funny because I think you could even say, you know, is peace possible with social distancing? Because it's not even about the handshake. It's about, can we even get into the same room with each other and actually have a conversation between the Israelis and the Palestinians? And that's been pretty challenging for the last 6 years. So what I want to do is I want to look back. I want to look back on kind of where we have gotten when it comes to peace and how the process has evolved, or maybe devolved, actually, is a better term to use for it. Where are we at now? You could argue we're at a stalemate. So really, to understand that, we have to figure out how we got here. So first of all, let's go back to this whole concept of a peace process, of making peace. And now we're specifically talking about the Palestinians, okay? Which all came around in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, when people started to say, maybe the Israelis and the Palestinians need to negotiate directly with each other. And remember, there had been an evolution of our conflict. If you go back in time to 1948, really what we were talking about was an Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel went to war with all these different Arab countries. And the Palestinians weren't fully a solidified people at that point who really identified themselves as Palestinians, but the individuals were obviously a part of that war, many of them becoming refugees. And eventually those people who were living in the territory between the river and the sea, the British Mandate of Palestine prior to the war, become Palestinians. And then as time goes on, the Arab-Israeli conflict, which continues which was ongoing, we fought the 56 Suez crisis, the Sinai campaign, and then we had 67, the Six-Day War, and 73, the Yom Kippur War. All of these wars were fought between Israel and Arab countries. As time went on, Israel made peace with Egypt in 1979. That was a peace process between Israel and the Arab countries. And then as time went on, the Palestinians had emerged with a very clear-cut identity. And they were putting their message out to the world, especially in the UN, which gave them a platform. And their leader, Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, comes forward, and he's very much demanding independence and sovereignty and self-determination for the Palestinians. And so that's why by the time we get to the 90s, there's this notion of, okay, let's have a conference, but let's also include the Palestinians. And there was that first conference that happened in the 1990s, the Madrid conference, between Israelis and the Arab countries, as well as the Palestinians. And nothing really came of that to a certain extent, but it will be that first step. And what will happen next is secret negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians in Norway, in Oslo. And then we have the Oslo peace process. And this will be the first time, and this will, I would say, probably the closest, the point where we were the closest in terms of at least Israeli society being on board with the notion of negotiating with the Palestinians. It was part of Israeli society. Obviously, we're not talking about everybody. And the Palestinians being willing to come to the table and actually have a direct dialogue. With obviously a mediator in between, which was the Americans during Oslo. But we were really sitting in that room and we were hammering out the different issues. So what are those issues? That's what we need to talk about as well. What are the issues that we need to overcome to make peace? So first of all, land is going to be a big one, obviously. We have a reality where there now is two people, okay, the Palestinians and the Jews, who both have pushed for self-determination. Now, the Jews achieved self-determination in 1948 with the formation of Israel. The Palestinians are still striving for their self-determination. The question would be, where is that going to happen, right? Now, up until now, it's pretty much been accepted that most likely a Palestinian state will emerge in the West Bank and in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and in Gaza. So land is going to be an issue. We're going to have to figure this out. And when we talk about that, you have to think about that. That either means that we have to share the land, okay? So either there's going to be a two-state solution, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and then Israel in between. Or one or the other side is going to have to let go of their calls for self-determination. And that's a one-state solution. A one-state solution would be from the river to the sea, right? From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, that there'd be one country. And that, depending on who would be the majority, it would either be a Jewish state or it would be a Palestinian state. So in that case of the one-state solution, you have a reality where only one side is going to achieve their national aspirations, which up until today, neither side has budged on their national aspirations. Israelis still very much, Jews still very much want self-determination, want Israel to exist and to continue to exist. Palestinians still very much want Palestine. Now, so when it comes to land, we're going to have to figure it out. Okay. And I guess the key thing that I'll point out here is that let's make it very clear. Neither side, the Jews nor the Arabs, have any intention of leaving. And so we're going to have to figure this out. And I would say for the Jews, unfortunately, we have to face the facts that demographically speaking, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are almost an equal number of Jews and Arabs. Now, I will tell you, there are a lot of people who would disagree with me. a lot of people who would try to argue that there are significantly less Palestinians than there actually are. The numbers that I use are from the army. Okay, so you can choose whether or not you believe the IDF, but the IDF believes that there's about 2 million Palestinians who live in Gaza and 2.5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank. And so with those numbers, add in the 2 million Arabs who live inside of Israel proper, you have about 6.5 million Arabs who live between the river and the sea. And today we have about 6.5 million Jews who live between the river and the sea. And again, neither one of us has any intention of going anywhere. So that's going to be one of the things that we have to figure out. So land, the notion of security, how is that going to work, right? Is the Palestinian state going to be militarized, not militarized? They're going to have a police force. What's that going to look like? We have to solve issues like the refugee problem, right? There's now today 5.5 million Palestinian refugees. Yes, many of them the descendants of the refugees from 1948, but according to the UN, they're recognized as refugees and they're still living in refugee camps, and they are definitely one of the final status issues. Maybe not for us as, you know, as Jews, as Israelis, we might say like, whatever, dude, they're just gonna have to live somewhere else. But for the Palestinians, this is a core issue that we cannot look past. This is something that has been a key sticking point for the Palestinians, really going all the way back to 1948 onwards, okay? So we have Palestinians, we have refugees, we have land. Jerusalem is gonna probably be the hardest thing that we have to overcome, which is what's gonna happen with this territory. Are we gonna divide Jerusalem? Is Israel gonna maintain full control over Jerusalem? And how is that gonna acquiesce with the Palestinian demand to have a capital here in Jerusalem? So there's a lot of issues we need to overcome. And what I wanna do is kind of trace how we've attempted to overcome them, and then also look at how they've all failed. So in Oslo, what we first tried to deal with was the land issue, right? So Israel said, you know what, Palestinians want self-determination on their own autonomous land. So let's start to give up territory, okay? This was obviously a left-wing perspective, not a right-wing perspective. Left-wing perspective will be post-67, let's give up land for peace. That's gonna be a left-wing ideology. The right-wing ideology will be, no, let's build settlements, let's develop this area, and eventually let's make it part of Israel. They would preach annexation. And I'm generalizing, obviously, the right and the left, but those are the generalizations of the right and the left. And so you had this territorial compromise from the left. We'll pull out of parts of the West Bank and Gaza and hand them over to the newly established Palestinian civil government, the Palestinian Authority, which then becomes the negotiating body moving forward alongside the PLO. Just to clarify, the PLO and the PA are side by side with each other. The PLO is basically the international organization of the PA. So the Palestinian Authority won't have, let's say, an embassy or a consulate in DC, but the PLO will, okay? So the PLO, the PA are doing the negotiations. So we start with the land issue. Israel will pull out of land, give territory to the Palestinians to govern themselves. Hopefully that'll work, and as time goes on, Israel can pull out of more land, and eventually we'll decide on final borders, okay? It didn't work in Oslo. We pulled out of territory, and the belief that giving up land would bring about more peace actually proved to just be the opposite. We pulled out of Area A, more land. We pulled out of major city centers in the West Bank and Gaza, and we ended up with more violence, right? And so it kind of played right into the right-wing hand, where they were saying, this is what we knew all along. This has nothing to do with land. This is about ideology, and you guys are playing right into the hands of the Palestinians by giving up territory, thinking that it's actually going to achieve peace. It didn't. Again, we had a massive increase in terrorism. So Oslo kind of fails when it comes to the territorial stuff. And the only other thing that we could really get through when it came to Oslo was two things. One, a Palestinian security force needed to be created. And so that kind of deals with the issue of security that we'll face moving into the future, that at least we know the Palestinians have a police force, and in areas that they're autonomous, they can police those areas. And that's what did happen post-Oslo during those years, and continues to happen until today, right? In Ramallah, you don't have Israeli military, you have Palestinian police who are policing the area, what they call Palestinian security forces. So, and then the other issue was it dealt with water, which is a final status issue that we're gonna have to deal with. Water is obviously a hot commodity in the West Bank, in the Middle East. And what we did during the Oslo Accords is we started to agree on water and figure out how water distribution would work. It worked for a while, until the Palestinians stopped cooperating with the water board. And then it has kind of become more challenging in the last 10 years as a result of that. So that was Oslo. Oslo falls apart mainly because, again, terrorism increases. And so there's a lack of buy-in from the Israelis, who, even some people on the left, but especially the right, who never believed that this, of this pulling out of any territory was going to bring about more peace. They kind of jumped on it and called out the left-wing government. How dare you do this? And so the will to want to further the peace process started to diminish within Israeli society, as well as in Palestinian society. Well, I should say diminish. Palestinian society, they weren't exactly talking about peace. And I think that's another really important point that I'll just stress is, we talk about, is peace possible? And we always frame it as peace, peace, peace. But I want us to understand that Palestinians don't talk in those terms. They talk in terms of justice, of freedom, okay? And so I just want you to understand that our conversations even are so different. There's such a wide gap between the Israelis and the Palestinians in terms of how we talk about the future. So Oslo failed, right? Palestinians are disillusioned. Their lives got worse after Oslo because now they're being taken care of by the Palestinian Authority and they're not doing a good job. They're really corrupt. And then comes 2000. And 2000 is going to be a major point in this process, because 2000 is going to be the moment where Israel puts a full-blown peace plan on the table for the Palestinians. And this is the moment where Ehud Barak, our prime minister in the year 2000, comes to Camp David alongside Bill Clinton and the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, also the head of the PA. And they have a negotiation. Ehud Barak puts a ridiculous offer on the table. Here we go, trying to solve the issues. So land, he offered the Palestinians in 2000, 94% of the West Bank with a 3% land swap, meaning we're taking 6% of the land because 94%, but we'll give you back 3% of that land in Israeli territory. So that was the agreement there, that we would withdraw from all of Gaza. So when it came to land and the notion of what at least people thought we were striving for, which was a two-state solution, Palestinians would have almost all of the land that they had wanted or that they have been demanding at least for their country. And again, let me be clear. I'm talking about the Palestinians who are moderate, who were talking about a two-state solution. There's a large population of Palestinians who don't buy into the two-state solution, who genuinely believe that from the river to the sea, this territory must be Palestine, and that the Jews really don't have the right to self-determination or to a country. And they would say, the Jews can live within our country, and we'll give them equal rights and we'll protect them, but they don't need the country of Israel. So again, let me be clear. I'm not saying that all the Palestinians are for the two-state solution, but those who are, these were the terms that they were talking about. So he offered 97% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza. That was land. When it came to security, he said, look, your country or the territory we're giving you has to be demilitarized. You can't have a full-blown army. But what you can have is a larger police force who will police your area. You cannot develop a military. That is something that Israel has kind of laid down as one of the main things that we say when it comes to peace, that if we're going to sign an agreement, there's no way that we're going to allow the Palestinians to develop a military. Then he talked about refugees. Now, he didn't allow for a right of return for refugees to Israel, which would be majorly problematic in terms of the demographic numbers. But he did say, we'll give $30 billion to the Palestinians so that they can resettle their refugees in their newly established state. And this is going to be a big compromise. And I'll talk more about this when we get to the end in terms of refugees. But that was kind of the compromise that we were looking at. And the last thing was he offered a shared capital in Jerusalem. And as Clinton kind of picked it apart and added his own 2 cents, we come up with these Clinton parameters at the end of 2000, which basically said that, the Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem would become Palestinian, the Jewish neighborhoods would remain Israel, and the old city would be divided. And it even got to this point, and this is really so crucial to talk about, is one of the key demands is not just a capital in Jerusalem, but it's having sovereignty and control over the Temple Mount, which of course we know as Jews is our number one holiest site where our temple stood. For the Palestinians and for Muslims, it's Haram al-Sharif, it's the noble sanctuary. And this is obviously a huge sticking point, but even if you look at the 2000 agreement, Barak went as far as saying the Palestinians could have sovereignty over the Temple Mount. And still we got a rejection from Yasser Arafat, and not just a rejection, but a huge punch in the face, because we offered a deal that was, at this point, again, to most Israelis, the closest that we could ever get to an offer for the Palestinians, like to the best offer we can make to the Palestinians that, again, wouldn't include the destruction of the state of Israel. And we got a rejection. And then we got a wave of terrorism, a 5-year-long wave of terrorism that killed over 1,000 Israelis. And people were burying their family members and their children. And it was horrific. It was a terrifying time to be living in Israel. And it really, unfortunately, took a lot of people who still very much believed in peace and believed in the peace process, and it destroyed them. And you had a lot of people walking away from the Second Intifada on the left who were saying, there's no way that peace is possible between us and the Palestinians, which was really sad, but that's what it did to us. We went from the highest of highs of the Camp David Agreement to the lowest of lows, which was the Second Intifada. Then some crazy stuff happens. There's an election in the Palestinian Authority, Fatah versus Hamas, right? Hamas gets elected, no one recognizes them. Hamas decides we want territory, and they take over Gaza by force in 2007 after Israel withdrew in 2005. And we had a reality in post-June 2007 where Hamas is now controlling in Gaza and Fatah is controlling in the West Bank, which is going to add a whole element of complication to the peace process. Because now it's, if we negotiate with Hamas or with Fatah, what about Hamas in Gaza? So then what happens is after that coup where Hamas takes over Gaza from Fatah, Fatah is in the West Bank terrified that Hamas is also going to take over in the West Bank. So they start to cooperate more with Israel. And actually, we'd say we had really good, to a certain extent, decent relations between the PA and Israel in those years of 2005, 6, 7, 8, all right? 2008, there's another offer, the last offer that's been put on the table between then and now. And this was proposed by Ehud Olmert in 2008. And again, the person receiving it is not now Yasser Arafat, as he died in 2004, but his successor, Mahmoud Abbas. A very similar offer in 2008. You had him offer 95% of the West Bank with a 5% land swap. So 100%, okay? If we think about it in terms of square mileage, it would be 100%. And all of Gaza, which again was easy because we had already withdrawn from Gaza. Same things, a shared capital in Jerusalem. He, even with refugees, he said, we'll give a big sum of money so that they can settle the refugees, but we're also going to allow some refugees to return inside of Israel, which was something that was a really big deal. Again, the number was very small though. We're talking about less than 15,000 people for family reunification purposes. And then Mahmoud Abbas, just like his predecessor said no. And again, this was like a real blow to the Israelis because, again, we're sitting here going, what else can we offer? Like, there's just, and I think the worst part was throughout all of this, there was never a counteroffer, which makes it really hard for Israel because we're always expected to put the offer on the table for them to then kind of say, well, we don't want this, but they don't even do that. So it puts Israel in a position of like, we don't even know what to offer in the next deal because they don't give us any feedback unless it's, well, no, we need a full right of return. But a full right of return, you can't have 5.5 million Palestinian refugees return to Israel. You just can't. It would eliminate the Jewish state as we know it because demographically speaking, we would not be a majority anymore. So the Palestinians would say, well, we still want a right of return. So their positions haven't really shifted much in the last 50 years, one could argue, which makes it very challenging. So in the last 12 years, what has happened? 2008. So we have attempts to start up negotiations during the last 12 years. So you've got in 2010, Bibi Netanyahu has now been elected. Palestinians, obviously one of their sticking points when it comes to negotiations is settlements. They don't want settlements to continue to grow. In fact, they would want settlements fully dismantled moving forward. And so Israel goes ahead and says, okay, they have a demand. We want to get them to the negotiating table. So what dawns on us is what I call the era of preconditions. Israel then has to give the Palestinians something just to get them to the negotiating table, which is remarkable. Again, the topic of this discussion where we said, can you make peace without a handshake? Hell, can we make peace if they're not even willing to sit at the same table with us or come into the same room as us? And so we have to kind of get them there by giving them something to begin with. And so in 2009, late 2009, early, and then into 2010, Bibi Netanyahu agrees to a 10-month moratorium on settlement construction, meaning no new buildings are going to be approved and buildings will not be constructed during this 10-month period, hoping that the Palestinians would then come to the table. They did, but 9.5 months into the moratorium. And they started to talk, and then 2 weeks later, they said when the moratorium was expiring and settlement construction was going to start up again, and remember, we're talking about expanding existing settlements. 2 weeks later, they say, you have to continue the moratorium or we're going to walk away from the table. And Bibi Netanyahu is going, if I continue this moratorium, my government's going to fall apart. Do you know how hard it was for him to get the right wing, Likud, to agree to a settlement moratorium? But he did it. The Palestinians squandered the opportunity. 2 weeks later, they said, we're not going to stay unless you continue the moratorium. We couldn't. They walked away. 3 years go by. There's another conflict in Gaza. And John Kerry is now Secretary of State, and he attempts his efforts for peace. And this is the last time that we negotiated with the Palestinians. It will be in summer 2013 through to about April of 2014. And to be honest with you, I have no idea what happened in those negotiations because they were kept completely under wraps. But there was straight up dialogue. Again, a demand for a precondition to even get the Palestinians to start that round of negotiations. Israel had to commit to releasing over 100 terrorists from Israeli jails. And yes, I called them terrorists because that's what they were. These are people who murdered people for nationalistic reasons. That is terrorism. And we did. Israel went ahead and released 100 terrorists from our jails throughout this peace process to try to, again, just make sure that the Palestinians stay at the table. The peace process fell apart in late March, early April. And the reason for that was because the Palestinians violated the terms of the peace talks. One of the terms said that the Palestinians are not allowed to go and join international bodies and take unilateral steps in the conflict. Well, during this process, they joined the International Criminal Court, which, funny enough, now is so relevant because of what is happening currently at the moment with the ICC. And that violated the peace talks. And so Israel said, you know what, we're not going to release the last batch of terrorists because you guys aren't taking this seriously. And we didn't release the last little batch of terrorists that we were supposed to release, and the peace talks fell apart. And then obviously things got way worse. You have 2014, that summer, you have this war with Hamas in Gaza, and even more so the separation between Fatah and Hamas is becoming clear. So again, moving forward, looking forward into the future, to kind of sum this all up, when we talk about is peace possible? Honestly, I think if you asked the average Israeli that question, the answer would be no, especially not with the current conditions. It's really sad. It's a sad thing to say. But, and if you, and why I started with Oslo is because if you had asked people in Oslo times in the 90s, if it was possible, there was so much hope that we were close, we were getting there, right? The Palestinians recognized Israel because that's what happened during the Oslo peace process. And then nothing came of it. And so it was these high hopes and then these dreams that were shattered. And unfortunately, no, the Palestinian society, I could say for sure, and this is the sad reality, is the Palestinian society has never adopted an education for peace, an education for, even if we don't talk, they call it peace, this notion of a two-state solution. They have never conceded the idea that Israel is going to remain. And when I say they, I'm talking again about Palestinian society, meaning the education, the rhetoric that's out there. You don't have people in their media talking about a two-state solution. They talk about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And so if we want to talk about is peace possible moving forward, one could argue peace will never be possible if we envision peace as either a two-state solution or an end to conflict and violence between Israelis and Palestinians. That is not going to happen unless Palestinians accept Israel's existence, and either the two solutions would be them living in Israel, living either in a Palestinian state alongside Israel peacefully, or them living in Israel peacefully. But again, why would that work? They have grievances against the state of Israel. Why would they all of a sudden live in the state of Israel? And I think the hardest piece of all of this is their education for 70 years now has taught them that we stole this land from them and that this land is rightfully theirs and that we genuinely don't have a right to be here. And so for the longest time, their cry has been from the river to the sea. And so when we say peace, well, our peace obviously envisions an Israel existing. But if the PA still kind of preaches this notion that Israel eventually is not going to exist, then we're definitely not getting any closer to a possible peace deal. Another thing to talk about is the leadership on both sides. You've got Mahmoud Abbas, who's been now in office since 2005. By the way, that was the last time that he was elected, which means that he's now in his 15th year of his 4-year term as president of the Palestinian Authority. And when he rejected the offer in 2008, that would have been my moment where I would have said, if he's not going to accept that and provide a counteroffer, what else could we offer this guy? Is this guy really interested in peace? If you watch the evolution of Mahmoud Abbas over the last 15 years, you will see that he has gotten less and less become less and less of a partner for peace is the point. Why do I say that? Because he has been less and less compromising as time has gone on, and more promoting things that are pushing us further away from peace. So that's him as an individual, the man who we're supposed to make peace with because he's the head of the PA. At the same time, this man is still insisting that he should be paying terrorists paying salaries to terrorists who are sitting in Israeli jails, that he's totally fine with the education that goes on TV shows and, children's programs that are preaching, violence towards Israel, an end to the Zionist country, et cetera, et cetera. And so none of that rhetoric coming from the Palestinian Authority down into the society is promoting a peaceful solution to this conflict, okay? Or in their minds, it would be a peaceful solution, just Israel wouldn't exist. And it would be their victory over the oppressor, which is Israel. On the Israeli side, first of all, we haven't had a government in a year and a half, which has made any kind of peace process impossible. And so that's obviously an issue. But even with that, if you go back to the government we had before, which was leaning more and more to the right, in terms of the coalition, I need to make clear. In terms of how people vote in Israel, actually, a lot of us vote either for the center-right or center-left parties, right? Likud or Labor, and now whatever are those parties today. Obviously, that changes constantly in Israel. But we vote center, but the coalition that's formed tends to be far to the right. And these people who are far to the right, when they talk about peace, their version of peace is a version of peace the Palestinians would never accept, because their version of peace doesn't include a Palestinian state in this territory. And meaning, when I say this territory, I mean between the river and the sea. And so that also is making it very hard to bridge the divide, because if we have people on our side, I watched a video this morning of one of our members of parliament. His name is Smotrich, and he's sitting there making a speech in the Knesset talking about how Palestinians don't exist, how this identity is just not real. And meanwhile, you had Arab members of Knesset who were sitting there listening, who identified as Palestinians. And not only does he not agree to a Palestinian state, he doesn't even agree that Palestinians exist. And with this kind of government, with somebody like that in our government, we're supposed to go and sit down with the Palestinians and try to negotiate peace with them. So I really want to make sure that I'm not just pointing the finger at the Palestinians. When it comes down to it, both the Israelis and the Palestinians have work to do when it comes to making peace. Has Israel done a lot more work? Yes. Has it been easier? Yes, because if you go back to 1937, the Jewish mainstream had kind of accepted the reality of partition. And you go back to 47 and we accepted partition. And so the notion of us having to share this land really has been a part of the Jewish conversation, the Zionist conversation, going back to 1937. For the Arabs, the Palestinians, that's not the conversation. They very much are still saying, from the river to the sea, we're not sharing this land. This needs to be all Palestine. Now, again, you have to go and look at polls of Palestinians in terms of who believes what. Do they recognize Israel? Do they see a two-state solution as a possibility? Some do, but some very much don't. And the rhetoric that's out there is not a conversation about a two-state solution amongst Palestinians. Again, mainstream Palestinians, I should say. So those are the challenges that we face. When it comes to moving forward, first of all, Israel has to figure out its government reality, but also notice that I think, and I'll wrap up with this and I'll take any questions. And if you have questions, please, submit them in the Q&A and I'll continue to take a look and we'll dive into your all questions. But I think that one of the important pieces here also is, if you look at the negotiations that were happening in Israel's elections and how Bibi managed to build this coalition with Benny Gantz, who broke off from his party with some of his, who basically divided his party. Part of it was about annexing parts of the West Bank. Now, annexation of parts of the West Bank is the new paradigm, okay? Meaning, if that's the conversation, we have shifted away from the conversation of what we used to talk about in terms of a two-state solution. And Israel is kind of, the offers that we made of 97% or 100% of the West Bank, at this point, we've moved past that. And the chances of that being proposed again are very slim. The reality is Israel, our primary concern is going to be our security. And so when we talk about annexing parts of the Jordan Valley, that's about Israeli security. And it's the realization that no matter what we do vis-a-vis the Palestinians, security is always going to be an issue. We have to be able to defend ourselves from threats, not just the Palestinian, but from threats throughout the Middle East. And that includes Iran, and that includes other proxies and terrorists who could, enter Jordan and try to infiltrate into Israel. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about, but there's not a lot going on. I'm going to make that very clear. There isn't conversations going on. There isn't an effort right now to create peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And even if there were, based on what we've seen in the past, and we have the same leadership, nothing would really change. we're really at an impasse. That's what it comes down to. And if I can jump to just one final thing, there's a book that came out a few years ago. It was very controversial. It's called Catch 67. I really recommend it. You know, his overall message in Catch 67 is, you know, both the right and the left had these very solid ideologies that in the last 30 years fell apart. Land for peace for the Israelis, for the left wing, and a greater Israel for the right wing. And both kind of just aren't possible. And so we're at a point where where both sides need to really figure out, the left and the right, figure out how they're moving forward. But most importantly, what he really talks about is, as a result of everything that's happened, you know, we've been talking about this paradigm of solving the conflict for so long, but maybe really the conversation that we need to be having is not about solving it right now because the conditions aren't right. So instead, what we need to be talking about is, how do we minimize the conflict? How do we lessen the impact of the conflict on Palestinians and on Israelis? So minimizing the conflict, and instead of talking about solving it, we talk about managing it. And that's really where we're at today. There's no conversations about a peace process. And Israel day to day is trying to figure out how to just manage the conflict and the different things that pop up day to day in terms of the threats that we face. And again, I think the biggest thing to think about is, if an opportunity did arise, if we saw a glimmer of hope, if Mahmoud Abbas passes away and, you know, his successor seems to be more moderate, Israel would jump at that opportunity if we had the right government in place. But we're just not there yet. And so we're really, again, at an impasse, and we're waiting for conditions to change. We're waiting for something to happen on the ground. And then I'm going to take this question because I think it'll be a great segue. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to take this first question that I see. Somebody asked about this organization called Roots. They said, are you familiar with peace movement groups in the Gush called Roots? Can you share thoughts on them if you do know them? So I'm so glad you brought up Roots, because for me, Roots is one of the few things that really give me hope for the future. And I say that, and that's so sad, like, that I have to like somehow find something that gives me hope. But, you know, I've been doing this now for 10 years, and I've been involved in the conflict for 20 years. And it's so sad to see kind of, again, how this notion of and how just the whole attempt to make peace, how it's really devolved over the last 20 years. So Roots is an organization, just so we understand what this organization is, it's an organization that brings together Palestinians and settlers. Now I'm using that term specifically, Israeli citizens who live in the Shtachim, in the territories. Now, why is that so important? Look, I love dialogue. I think dialogue is amazing. I think bringing the two sides together is crucial. However, I have a lot of criticism for other organizations, not Roots, who do this. Because historically what we've had is these organizations who have been creating conversations between Israelis and Palestinians are usually left-wing Israelis talking to Palestinians. And the problem with that is there are a lot of left-wing Israelis who say, like, well, why do I care about the West Bank? That doesn't matter to me, you know, and they're not going to sit in a dialogue with Palestinians and say to them, well, Judea and Samaria is actually really important to the Jewish people. You know, you guys talk about your connection as Palestinians. Well, let me tell you my connection as a Jew. Let's go back to Hebron, you know, a place that I can go and I can look at these ruins and I can imagine my forefather Abraham walking through this area and buying this area, right? I'm connected to it too. That's something that somebody who is either, again, religiously motivated or knows more about our history, and even me, who I'm not really on the right or on the left, I can stand in the middle and I can say that. But someone on the left would really discount it and say, and basically what happened in these dialogue groups is the left-wing Israelis who were speaking to the Palestinians would just be agreeing with the Palestinian cause. And so they wouldn't be verbalizing the Israeli side of the story or the Jewish side of the story. What I love about Roots is it brings together Palestinians, but Jews and Israelis who are really connected to the land and have a very strong ideological belief in that. And so Palestinians then get the opportunity to hear from Jews who will debunk a lot of the education that they've gotten, which is that the Jews don't have a connection to this land. And so Roots does amazing work bringing these people together. And I just want to give you a couple examples of what they've done in the past. You know, about a year ago, February, there were two murders that took place. One was a terrorist attack against an Israeli, Olian Spacher, an 18-year-old who was murdered. And another one was an honor killing of an Arab woman in Jerusalem by her family. I know these are not comparable in any way, shape, or form, and I'm not comparing them. What is comparable is the grief of the families, okay? The grief of those who are mourning the loss of these women. And what this organization did during that time was you had a group from Roots who were both Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Israelis, wow, can't talk, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Arabs, Jews, Muslims, etc., coming together and going to the homes of these people. And so they went together to the home of the Arab woman who was killed and showed and expressed their condolences. And then they all went to the Shiva of Oriansbacher and her family in a settlement in Tekoa. And you had Palestinians coming into this home and expressing their condolences. And that to me is just, that is the key to the future. It's Israelis and Palestinians pushing past the media and the rhetoric and the brainwashing that takes place and coming together and seeing each other eye to eye. And I think what Roots preaches, their solution to the conflict, which is interesting, it's called Two People, One Homeland, where it's an acknowledgement that both the Israelis and the Palestinians very much believe, Jews and Palestinians believe, that from the river to the sea, this land is ours. And we have a connection to all of it. And they acknowledge that. The people, Arabs, Palestinians within Roots will acknowledge my connection to the land. And the Israelis, the Jews who are part of Roots, will acknowledge the Palestinian connection to the land. And they come together. And actually, crazy enough, they use that love of the land to unite. And so they say two people, one homeland. And the idea is really to have, it's a two-state solution. They're just not calling it that. It would be two different entities. It would be two different countries, or at least two different governments for sure, with sovereignty over specific territory, but in a great relationship with each other. And where people could travel freely to these different locations, to these two different entities, be it Israel and Palestine. And to me, I mean, again, I don't know what you hope the future to be, but for me, I want to see a future where Israelis and Palestinians just don't hate each other anymore and understand each other better and can again live side by side with each other. We have to acknowledge there's always going to be extremists, but if the mainstream is moderate and is preaching coexistence and an end to violence, eventually they will overpower those who are preaching more violence, like Hamas. So Roots is amazing. I highly recommend looking into them. I highly recommend checking out their videos of Ali Abu Awad and Shaul Yudelman and Noor Awad and hearing from them, because it's really, this is on the ground grassroots work that could really truly make a difference in this reality. So that's that about Roots. Great question. Love the organization. Check them out. Again, I've just got to stress, you're not going to necessarily like everything that the Palestinians have to say. We need to hear it, whether you like it or not, or whether you agree with it or not, whether you think it's factual or not. When it comes to talking one-on-one with people and acknowledging people's experiences, it's a matter of kind of putting that aside for a second. And that I think is crucial. Let's get to another one. Irene asks, do you think that the status quo is sustainable for years? You know, at this point, I think we've seen that it is, in the sense that we've been living in status quo pretty much since Oslo. I mean, yes, what has changed, and this is what I'll stress, which can continue to change, is Israel's security measures have changed. The reality of what occupation, what our presence in the West Bank looked like, during the Intifada, the second Intifada between 2000 and 2005, is very different from what it looks like today. So when we say maintain the status quo, or is it sustainable? I think we have to keep working at it to keep it sustainable, I guess is the point. In that, a lot of Israelis have come to the conclusion that our presence in the West Bank is necessary. Even people on the left who very much disagree and don't want us there and don't want us controlling the Palestinians, many of them have come to the conclusion that, yes, I still very much believe in that, but right now, there's really nothing that we can do that wouldn't actually make the situation worse in terms of withdrawal from that area. So we have to be there. That being said, what the army has done is they've spent a lot of time in the last 20 years trying to perfect our security measures in the West Bank, trying to minimize, again, the impact of those measures on the day-to-day lives of Palestinians. So to give you an example, back during the Intifada, we had about 240 checkpoints strewn throughout the West Bank, meaning a Palestinian on a day-to-day basis would go through multiple checkpoints and they'd wait in very long lines. As time went on, we developed more strategies and new strategies. And one of the big ones, if anyone is a Fauda fan, one of the big ones is the house arrests and the undercover operations that go on within the West Bank, because house arrests, then basically what we've done is we've taken the fight to the terrorist rather than waiting for the terrorist to come to us at a checkpoint. And what has that done for the day-to-day average Palestinian is, well, they don't have to go through checkpoints now. I mean, today there are about 10 active checkpoints within the West Bank, give or take. So that's a massive reduction that has, again, led to an increase in quality of life for the Palestinians because it's less of an infringement on their movement. And so what we can do to maintain and sustain the status quo is make sure that with the reality we're living in today, that Palestinians still have opportunities and that our presence there infringes on them as little as possible. And that allows us to maintain our security. So I do think it's sustainable as long as we continue to work at it. And that is the key. It's not just sitting back and saying we're not going to do anything. It's taking baby steps to get us closer. And really the sad reality is that to get us closer it's the ideological battle. And so Roots is doing, those are the efforts that we need to see, because we can do what we want as an army to minimize those things, but there still needs to be a conversation within the Palestinian society about moving forward and breaking down the ideological barriers, which is, Israel is our enemy. Israel did this huge injustice to us, right? It's a matter of changing that thought process or saying, yes, there was an injustice done to us 70 years ago, but it's now been 72 years. And it's better for us to let go and move forward rather than remain in the past. These are the things that need to happen. Those small steps, not big, attempts at peace publicly in the media. That just, unfortunately brings out all of the crazies to the surface. And so at this point, many people believe we just got to continue to do what we're doing, maintain status quo, and while we're doing that, take baby steps. So yeah, I mean, it is. Again, it's hard to predict the future, but for right now, we've seen that, nothing has changed that dramatically in the last 10 years, and we've managed to maintain the status quo. More questions. Let's see what else we've got here. How do you feel about the way the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is portrayed in the media and TV shows, movies such as Fauda, Bethlehem, etc.? So to be honest with you, I don't watch Fauda. And the reason for that, some of you probably went, the reason for that is because it's very real for me. Again, I lost friends in terrorism, and so it's very hard for me. I suffer from PTSD, so I don't watch that. I don't watch Fauda. I am very familiar though with Fauda. So let's quickly talk about Fauda. First of all, I think is fantastic. Again, I haven't seen it, but I know enough about it. I think it's fantastic because, and I very much trust the makers of it to show really as honest a picture as possible of what's going on in Israel and in the territories. And I know that because the creators, I really trust the creators, and specifically Avi Sakharov, who is the creator, the journalist who created Fauda alongside Lior Raz, who was in the unit itself. So Lior Raz can bring an authenticity to what the unit that they're following actually does in the army. Avi Sakharov is able to bring the balance. Now, Avi Sakharov, you should look him up. This is a guy who used to write for Haaretz. He was very far to the left. And as time went on and the second Intifada hit and all this stuff, he kind of walked back to the middle. And he now writes for the Times of Israel. And so he really gets the Palestinian perspective as well as the Israeli perspective. And so somebody who's kind of gone through that, like being on one side and then pulled to the middle, things like that, are really great at then showing the nuance and the complexity. And I think that's what Fauda does really, really well, is it shows, and it really makes your heart, pull to both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And in my opinion, it should. The simple reality is that there are human beings on both sides of this conflict who are suffering. And so I don't think any Israeli Zionist, anybody should say, I don't care at all about Palestinians. Like, come on, these are innocent people just like you are. Okay. Obviously I'm not talking about terrorists. I'm talking about innocent people. And I think that show does an incredible job at showing that complexity. And so let's contrast that with the media, who doesn't show complexity at all or nuance at all. So I have a huge problem with how this conflict is portrayed by the media. Now, granted, do I just wholly blame the media? Yes and no, but I also think they're slaves to the medium, in the sense that if you're on the news, you have very short time, a very short window to tell a very complex story, which is very hard. It's still possible, and they can make more of an effort as far as I'm concerned, but it's still very challenging. But more than that, I think the media, to a certain extent, has decided this conflict. They have decided that Israel's in the wrong and the Palestinians are in the right. They've played into the power dynamics of, the weak versus the strong. And they've really played into the reality of, into the power dynamics of, if you're the strong one, then you're wrong, right? Strong equals wrong. And so that's how they portray the conflict. Yeah, it bothers me that, 300 rockets can be launched into Israel and I won't hear about it on CNN until Israel responds to Gaza. And so then I'm turning on the news and all I see is Israel bombing Gaza, but I'm not aware of the fact that 300 rockets were launched into Israel prior to that attack. And so oftentimes they get it wrong. They do not show complexity. They don't show nuance. There can't be good guys and bad guys on both sides, according to the media. They need a simple story because they have to sell you a simple story. And the simple story that they are going to sell you is an oppressor versus an oppressed. That's the reality. And unfortunately have become the oppressor. So while Fauda, I so appreciate because it's made by Israelis who can really show that nuance. And it's made by Israelis, I genuinely think, who very much care about accuracy, like Avi Sakharov, versus the media, who I think have an agenda and unfortunately very rarely tell the whole story in a very legitimate way. So it's not good, which is, again, probably why I do what I do. And I think you all can acknowledge this. I work in a sphere that is education in an informal platform to try to raise our voices as individuals to overpower the media, and to really correct what the media is getting wrong. And what my generation, at least, is most of us, we're not looking at the news. We're looking at social media. And so the power that we have today to really challenge this is that every one of us can be a source of information, as opposed to in the past where our sources of information were the media. Today, we can be the source of information. And that's the power that we have with social media. And so, yes, it's a challenge, but we now do have a lot more tools to be able to counter it, and really push against it, which is happening. And there are organizations, by the way, that I praise, Honest Reporting and others, who very much are constantly monitoring the media to make sure that they get it right. But we're still obviously at a disadvantage because of power dynamics. And again, just how people interpret things in their head. So that's the media. Let's see, try to take one or two more questions as we get into this. Sorry, I'm just trying to read these questions. Oh, okay, there's no more in the chat. Let's see in the Q&A. From Perry, hi Perry. How do we move forward? How do we move towards a time when the Palestinians leaders care more about their own people than they do about killing you and me? Listen, it's a great question. I think it all invokes in us kind of the Golda Meir quote, which is, I'm sure, what you were referring to, Perry. And hi, Perry, thanks for tuning in. Look, I think it's a minimization to a certain extent of what's going on. I do think Palestinian leaders care about their children. I just think they have a very different view of the world and what that means to care about people. And, where we in the West would say, providing a better future for our children and, overcoming adversity are things that we value. For the Palestinians, their entire peoplehood has been revolving around their victimhood. And so for them, when we talk about them caring about their children, for them fighting this fight against Israel is doing their children a service. Because for them, letting go of it and saying, you know what, we give up is so much worse, because for them, in their culture, that's shameful, right? Remember, they really function in a system of honor and shame. And they've been living in shame, unfortunately, for 70 years. They go back and they say, look at what Israel did to us in 1948, 49. And so they've lived with that shame. And the only way to really regain their honor is by fighting back. And so they think they are helping their people. I know that sounds crazy, but they do. And then let's just acknowledge one very important thing. There's people and then there's leaders. And as much as we in the West probably want to see our leaders as people who are trying to make the world a better place, and we all know what drives somebody to be a leader is also power. And in the Palestinian realm, let's acknowledge that people who have worked for the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership have profited tremendously off of this conflict. And what do I mean by that? I mean, they get a lot of aid from around the world, and they make sure to line their pockets first and foremost before any of that aid is passed then down to the people. So Mahmoud Abbas has become a millionaire as leader of the Palestinian Authority. Yasser Arafat died as a millionaire, and his wife is still living off of that aid until today. And so I think it's a lot. It's more than that. It's how do we get the Palestinian leadership to really want to end this conflict and bear the responsibility. And I think this is crucial. Bear the responsibility of actually then needing to take care of their people and build a country. It is so much easier to sit in conflict and to blame Israel for everything. It is a lot harder to say, you know what, I still blame Israel, but I want a country and I want progress and I want a better life for my children. And so that's what I'm going to shoot for. No, because you know what that requires? A lot more effort, a lot of work that they've managed to avoid for a long time. And so that's really what it comes down to, is how do you get somebody to care more about their whole entire future versus just themselves? And that's another huge challenge that we're facing. So I don't think we have time for more questions. Thank you for everyone who did submit questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them. I will very much do my best. Or if anyone does want to get in touch with me, ask me more questions.
Why don't you put your email address in the chat? People can email. But if there's a topic from our participants, guys, if there's a topic that you would like for us to cover with Charlotte another time with another speaker, just please place that thought of a topic right here in our chat so we can book somebody or book Charlotte again to speak on that particular topic.
So I just put my email address. Oh, I forgot the K. Sorry. 1 second. There we go. Now my actual email address, even though the first one will work as well. But there's my email address. Feel free to be in touch with me. Ariella, I would be happy to do another one of these if you want to hone in on one specific topic. I hope you got from this the taste of kind of who I am. And I really try my best to come at this from as much of a central position as possible and also using as much facts as possible. So I'm really happy to dive into any of the issues that we discussed, go deeper, go back into the past, whatever anyone would like, happy to do that. If not, if you had a question that I wasn't able to get to, please, you can shoot me an email and I'd be happy to answer it that way. For now, thank you all so much for tuning in, and I'll hand it back to Ariella. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again. It's really nice to see you. Charlotte has spoken with our ICANN high school students as well for the past 2-3 years, and it's so nice to get to know you. We miss seeing you in person, but it's so nice to catch up with you on the webinars.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Hopefully soon by you, right? Get me out.
Keep safe.
Get me back on tour. Thank you to everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see you all again.
Bye.
Bye.